Son of a bitch.
Groovy.
Hey everybody, this is Matthew Movies coming at you with my review of Justice League, the 2017 DCEU movie that I am very much of two minds about. There are parts of this movie that I liked a lot. When I finished watching it, I was like, oh, that was pretty good. I had a pretty good time watching that. But once I started actually thinking about the movie, there are large flaws with it in my personal view. There are parts of it that I'm like, "Urgh." And right off the hop, I mean, one of the coolest moments in the entire movie is right at the beginning of the flick. They set up the character of Steppenwolf, the big villain, and they show how there was this convergence of man, the Amazonians and the Atlanteans taking him on. And it was a really, really cool moment. But as soon as it starts playing, I'm like, wow. Am I watching Justice League or am I watching Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring? Because it is exactly the same setup, exactly the same scene. They create this character that is basically the exact same as Sauron right off the hop. And, you know, it was a very, very cool moment, but to me, really points to the dichotomy of this film. Because it was very cool, it looked awesome, but it really felt like they were cribbing that scene, and it looked visually extremely similar. It wasn't unique, it wasn't original, it was cool, but that's really the feeling I get from this movie. I thought that there were a lot of characters that were great, but also at times they didn't really seem to understand those characters. I mean, Gal Gadot is back as Wonder Woman, and I thought she was great in this as well. Definitely one of the best aspects of this film. I really enjoyed her character and some of the back and forth. I mean, her and Batman have a lot of really interesting moments. The whole Steve Trevor thing between the two of them, it was an interesting moment and kind of hard to watch, but at the same time, the way they kind of played it off later, I thought that was all well handled. I thought basically everything with Wonder Woman was good. I liked Batman in this movie. I felt like Ben Affleck was kind of mailing it in to a certain degree. He didn't really seem to have a lot of passion for his role, but at the same time that kind of works for the character, so that was cool. But I also didn't really love the way that they played him to a certain degree, where they kept going back to I'm rich, bitch. That's not really who the character is. I mean, yes, he is extremely wealthy and he uses those means to do the things he does, but he's not all about bragging about how powerful and rich he is. He's, supposed to be this incredibly intelligent detective guy who, at his core, kind of eschews the whole wealthy lifestyle. So for that to kind of keep coming up over and over again, I felt like that they didn't necessarily understand the character. And I mean, that's the whole thing for me with Zack Snyder, is I really feel like he with all three of the movies, he doesn't really understand who these characters are. He gets them kind of only on the surface level. So he's like, oh, Bruce Wayne, he's super rich, so that's how I'm gonna play him. And he was well handled in the fact that he was enjoyable to watch, and his fight sequences were pretty cool and all that stuff. But I just didn't really think that this was a great representation of the character. And then even when he did get in the big battle scene at the end, he kind of felt like an added on character. Aside from starting things off, he seemed almost kind of useless. He didn't really do much of anything in the battle, and that is not what Batman should be. And it was the same thing with Batman v Superman. I mean, he was just kind of there and avoiding Doomsday, and in this he's just kind of, he throws in his blows and all that kind of stuff, but he doesn't do anything overly effective. And yes, he's definitely the least powerful from a just actual superhero powers kind of aspect of any of the characters in this movie that have abilities, but he's one of the most powerful mentally, so he should have had a much bigger role during the actual battle. And yeah, he came up with a lot of the plans and all that kind of stuff, but I just felt like let down by his character in the actual battle. Whereas Superman, I loved his battle sequences. I thought he was great. I mean, the whole thing with the Flash, where the Flash was looking at him, I mean, that was all great. And when he's taking on the Justice League, I thought that was an impressive sequence for sure. I didn't necessarily love the way the character was played, and the whole thing with him didn't really make a whole lot of sense to me, where they were like, oh, oh, there's no way to know what he'll be like when he comes back, and I didn't love the way that he came back. I'm not gonna go into that because I don't want to give any major spoilers or whatever. But the like at first where he is kind of like, you know, this kind of dark character, and then all of a sudden instantly he's like, it was like the first time we've seen Superman actually smile on film, and it made no sense coming out of what he had just been through. It just was like, oh, there's been a lot of complaints about the fact that he's not a happy character, so let's give them that. It didn't feel earned to me. And of course the whole thing with the mustache, I mean, that was definitely pretty noticeable in moments. I mean, his face looked pretty funny. They handled that CGI aspect pretty poorly, but at the same time, I mean, I enjoyed a lot of the moments. It was awesome seeing him in the fight sequences, and I'd say he was almost a little bit too powerful because it felt like he didn't really need the help of the rest of the Justice League to take on Steppenwolf, but it was still awesome to see. And again, I mean, I think he's a great example of the way I feel about this movie, where, you know, I loved watching him, but I felt like from like when I actually started thinking about the character, there was, you know, a lot of problems there. And another character though that I would say was pretty straightforward, I didn't really have any real issues with, was Barry Allen, the Flash. And I am not a DC Comics guy, right? Like, I've read lots of Marvel comics, and so I don't know. When I watch a Marvel movie, I will know like how a character is handled in the adaptation. So I don't know how well other like comic fans will take this version of Barry Allen, because from what I understand, it's a pretty big departure from who the character is in the comics. But as a guy who's just going into it, not really knowing much about him, I found him to be a lot of fun and very entertaining. A lot of his jokes didn't necessarily hit, but they were fun, and he was a lovable character. I love Ezra Miller as an actor. I dug him in so many different things, and I thought he was very entertaining in this. And then you have Jason Momoa's Aquaman, who had the biggest moment in it when I first watched this movie, that I was like, wait, what? No, wow, they just are not thinking about these characters at all. And in that, basically, the way they set up Aquaman in this movie, they try to make him really, really cool and angsty and awesome. Like, he's like the rebel of the group. And you know, I think they did that to a large degree to kind of play off of everybody's reaction to Aquaman as being this really lame character from the comics. And I know in the comics, he cut off the hand was gone. They made him into a total badass. So I didn't necessarily have that big of a problem with that. But there's a moment in this movie where he gets a bottle of liquor and he's walking out into the ocean. He's drinking it, and then he throws the bottle into the ocean. I'm like, so let me get this straight. The protector of the ocean is littering in the ocean. That's where we are. Because it seemed cool in the movie, that's what you're going to have this character do. My God, that just blew me away. I was like, wow. There was a couple minutes there where I was like, wow. I can't pay attention to this movie anymore because that was so appalling to me. But throughout the rest of the movie, you know, he was a very surface deep level. I don't necessarily think that he was very well set up for a subsequent film per se, but he was an entertaining part of this movie, and I do want to see him in another movie. It's just there's not a lot there for them to play off of. So again, you know, he's a character that I thought was entertaining, but poorly handled. And Cyborg, I thought, was kind of useless. I mean, they set him up as basically an exposition scene character where he had this connection to what was going on, so he could explain things to people. And they did a decent job of setting him up as being fairly angry about his situation, and that was fairly understandable. But after setting up that aspect of him, it was pretty much dropped throughout the rest of the movie. And he wasn't overly angsty throughout the rest of the movie, which didn't really work for me because they set him up to be that way, so I don't know why he wouldn't be that way throughout the rest of the movie. I mean, like his relationship with Wonder Woman was interesting because, you know, she's such a charming character. You can kind of see him necessarily being charmed by her, but he never really had that aspect of his character, which seemed to be completely dropped after a certain point. And also, like, his abilities, I felt were fairly nebulous because going into this movie, I didn't really know a lot about some of the characters I mean, obviously I know Superman, Wonder Woman, and Batman, but I didn't really know much of anything about who he is as a person, and I definitely didn't know what his abilities were, and it seemed like he was basically like whatever the situation called for, he can do, and so I didn't love that, and maybe that's who the character is. His cybernetic abilities can just basically adapt to whatever situation he falls into, but I didn't love that aspect, and if that is the case, that I felt like that should have been kind of explained. And yes, I understood that like new abilities were popping up. They did explain that very, very briefly, but it seemed to be very convenient new abilities. And Lois Lane was back, and I thought she was one of the brighter parts of this movie. I liked her character in it. I felt like she was you know, kind of like a bit of pepper in there, where she wasn't in it a whole heck of a lot, and I couldn't stand the way they handled her in Batman v Superman. So for her to, you know, be an integral part of this story, and the way in which they had her interact with Superman I thought was well handled. I didn't love the scene with her and Martha Kent. It seemed pretty tacked on, but otherwise I enjoyed her. And of course Alfred was back, and I thought he was great, just as good as he was in Batman v Superman. I thought he was one of the highlights of that film as well. So I liked that. But then you had Steppenwolf, the main villain of the movie, which I did not care for whatsoever. I felt like he was just kind of a means to an end and a reason to bring everybody together. I hated the look of him. He was so, like, the CG. I didn't think looked very good, and he didn't feel very threatening because he was all CG. Like, there was no palpable. Like your mind just basically realizes, oh, that's basically a cartoonish villain that's right there, and so I never really felt any threat from him. So I did not find him to be very effective in the movie whatsoever, unfortunately. Which I mean, it's a big problem with superhero movies, and I felt like it definitely was a problem here. I felt like Doomsday was much more effective in Batman v Superman than he was, and I thought they did a pretty good job of explaining how powerful he was, and his whole connection to the parademons and all that kind of stuff was well handled. And I mean, that's the whole thing right there. The parademons, I mean, again, we just have the Shikari basically back, where this is mindless horde of beings that can be fodder for superheroes to destroy, and they're very useless from any kind. I mean, Avengers Age of Ultron did it with all the different Ultrons. I'm really growing to detest the army of mindless thugs that are there to be just hacked apart. It was useless. I will say that their last moment in the movie was definitely their best aspect of the film, and the one thing that I thought was well handled. The Amazonians I did not care for in this movie. I thought they were much better handled in Wonder Woman, and again, I thought that there was a lot of exposition with their characters. It was very, very poorly handled. It didn't feel organic by any stretch of the imagination, so that let me down. I loved seeing Jim Gordon, and I mean, J.K. Simmons is just such a fantastic actor. It was really, really cool to see him, and I really want to see more of him as that character. I thought he really had a lot of basically gravitas to his performance. And I mean, really, at the end of the day, this movie, like I said before, I feel like it's a tale of two films, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that it was made by two guys, Joss Whedon and Zack Snyder, and I felt like neither of the positives of either of them were really on full display. I mean, the visuals I thought were kind of a letdown from the previous Zack Snyder DCEU movies, because I thought that was his one major strength in the previous movies, is they looked fantastic. And this movie, to me, was not nearly as visually stunning, but at the same time, I thought had a better handled story. So, you know, you had a little bit of the strength of Joss Whedon, where he understands character and story better, but it was also kind of a little bit ruined by some of the moments that were there to just look cool. So it was funny. You didn't have any of the real strengths of either the directors, in my view, or any of the real negatives of them. It was kind of for me, it was a fairly middle of the road film. I enjoyed it. I walked out of it fairly happy, but I feel like subsequent viewings, I'll like it less and less. But at the same time, I feel like I will always have a good time watching it. So if I was going to give it a score out of 10, I would say it's a solid 7. So those are my thoughts on Justice League. Let me know in the comment section below what you think, if you were a fan of it, if you loved it, if you think the critics are being far too harsh, which I personally actually do feel like the critics are being a little harsh on it. There's a lot of anger towards it that I don't necessarily feel is warranted, because because it's not an abhorrent movie. For me, if I was gonna rank it in the DCEU, I'd say it's probably my second favorite of them all. So if that gives you any idea of my view on it, I definitely don't think it's a terrible movie. I just think it had some pretty palpable flaws. So like I said, let me know in the comment section below what you think, if you were a fan of it, if you hated it, if you loved it, if you feel like people are far too harsh on it, whatever. Other than that, please hit that like button, hit that share button. It makes it much more likely that other people will come check out this review and let me know what they think, which would be awesome because I love talking to people about movies. And speaking of which, if you are new here and you just haven't done it yet, please hit subscribe, hit that notification bell. That way you can find out when I put out a new video and come check it out and give me that feedback, which would be awesome. Aside from all that though, have yourself a good day.